Spider-Man's comic history is jam-packed with excellent stories and arcs that are just begging for some sort of adaptation. Now, recently we did a video about 10 Spider-Man stories we need in the MCU, but here's the thing, guys. I think there are even more. So today I want to talk about 10 more stories and storylines centered around our friendly neighborhood Spider-Man that we need to see in the MCU. Venom, Harry Osborn, a Human Torch team-up, Maximum Carnage, I'm talking about them all. Let's get started right now. Okay, I promise guys, this list will have more original stories than just the Venom origin, but I have to start with the classics. I mean, seeing the whole arc where Spider-Man bonds with the piece of Venom that Tom Hardy left behind, and see it slowly start to corrupt him and turn him dangerous is actually a very logical plot point for Tom Holland's Spider-Man 4. I think this is definitely one of the biggest storylines we need to see in the MCU right now. Because think about it, we last left Peter as someone who has completely erased his personal life. It's all about how he's embracing his Spider-Man side completely, so it would make sense if we explore the consequences of that. If we see Peter get his black suit and then slowly become more violent and aggressive as he fights more street-level bad guys, then that would serve as a lesson for him to learn and a tailspin for him to spin out of. Everyone knows that one of the problems with Maguire's Spider-Man 3 was how it crammed the Venom storyline in there, but now we could have Holland's Spider-Man 4 be all about the acceptance and eventual rejection of the black suit, with the 5th movie serving as the full MCU introduction of Venom. And I wanted to start with the black suit because that could influence some more overall Spidey comic stories in the MCU. For instance, the Back in Black comic story. Now here's what happened in the comics. This was after Civil War where Peter's identity was revealed to the world. He found his loved ones targeted and Aunt May was shot by an assassin. While she was in a coma, Peter went full-on rampage mode. He embraced his inner darkness and angrily hunted down the people responsible, even donning the black suit because, you know, that just looks more intimidating. Gone was the quippy, fun version of Peter Parker that we all know and love. This Peter was a man on a mission. So it's easy to look at that story and see how that could be adapted to the MCU. Aunt May is now gone and Peter has lost everyone in his life, so we could see him going on a vengeful streak because of it. Plus, what's cool about this story is that Kingpin was the one who ordered the assassin, so that would be a neat way to tie in a 4th Spidey movie that teams the webhead up with Daredevil. Sounds neat, right? We've seen Peter take on the Sinister Five in the MCU, so what comes next? If they wanted to up the ante in a serious way, then the MCU should probably think about adapting the Gauntlet storyline from the comics. In that arc, Spider-Man is basically forced to fight a ton of his villains back to back to back. This led to a ton of interesting individual battles that slowly started to wear Peter down. And then the MCU could do one of two things. They could either leave it at that, meaning there's no big mastermind behind this onslaught of villains, or they could go a different route. If the Gauntlet is adapted and Spidey has to fight all his previous still-alive villains, as well as some new ones, then that would serve to highlight how tough Spider-Man has it and his battles will always be constant. Or the comics eventually revealed that this whole thing was set up by Kraven the Hunter's family to wear Spidey down so they could sacrifice him and use his blood to bring Kraven back from the dead. Now that would be weird in the MCU since we haven't seen Kraven, but again, I'm sure there's a way to adapt it to make it fit. So we've had Harry Osborn in both the Maguire and the Garfield Spider-Man films, so does that mean we should bring him into the MCU? The big question is there enough story to tell the story we've seen before both differently and perhaps improve upon it? Honestly, that's going to be tough. Sure, there's a very good argument to be made that the Spider-Man movies should avoid Harry Osborn and his Goblin father, especially after already using Green Goblin in No Way Home. But then again, Peter's friendship with Harry Osborn is incredibly important, and it would fit where we are right now in the MCU. Peter needs new friends, so why couldn't he befriend the loner rich kid Harry Osborn? And I think the Best of Enemies arc, which eventually saw Harry not only save Peter's life, but lose his own due to Goblin formula poisoning, is something that the MCU could work toward. Not all stories need to be told in Spidey 4, but rather we can introduce the seeds now for an eventual later movie. That was the problem with The Amazing Spider-Man 2. It introduced Harry Osborn and then turned him bad immediately. The Holland Spider-Man franchise has time to space things out. What do you think? Harry Osborn in the MCU, yay or nay? So I already talked about upping the ante a bit for the next Spidey movie, but what if I told you that there was a time where Peter didn't just fight the Sinister Six, he instead fought the Sinister 12, which is absolutely a way less cool sounding name. Seriously guys, didn't want to think of something a bit more alliterative? Anyways, in the Marvel Knights arc, we see Peter lock away Norman Osborn. But then after Osborn orchestrates the kidnapping of Aunt May, Peter has to essentially team up with Black Cat in order to break Osborn out of prison. Of course, once he does this, the Green Goblin immediately betrays Spider-Man and the Sinister 12 show up to stall Peter while Osborn goes to try to eliminate Mary Jane. The cool part about this? Just when the chips seem down, a ton of heroes like the Avengers, the Fantastic Four, and Daredevil show up to help Peter in this complete brawl. I like the idea of adapting this to the MCU. Peter could be on his own for a bit, not sure if he still has a place on the Avengers now that no one remembers his secret identity, but then when he's overwhelmed by an enemy, the heroes of the MCU could show up and help him save the day. All superheroes tend to suffer serious losses from time to time, but Spider-Man is usually the one who suffers the most. He's constantly faced with the burden of not being able to save those he truly cares about. Uncle Ben, Gwen Stacy, Jean DeWolff, George Stacy, all these casualties really affect Peter's psyche, and he has to push himself to keep going forward. Heck, in the MCU, he's now lost his Aunt May, which usually in the comics is his one anchor. And they'll do things like have Peter make a deal with Mephisto to magically bring Aunt May back to life at the cost of his marriage to Mary Jane. Yeah, so it's understandable why we were all so shocked that May didn't make it out of No Way Home. Anyways, what are the long-term effects of May's demise in the MCU? Could it lead to an adaptation of No One Dies? In that arc, J. Jonah Jameson's wife has just been killed, and it's a sad funeral. Afterwards, Peter is tormented by nightmares of people like Uncle Ben and Gwen Stacy as he struggles with his feelings of guilt over not saving them. I think someone like this could be cool for the MCU for a few reasons. For one, it would show how Peter is moving forward without May, which will be important. Second, it would allow the chance for the MCU to introduce Uncle Ben in a dream sequence, so we can finally see who was attractive enough to pair up with Aunt May. Third, we could use this to bring back Iron Man and have one last conversation between Tony and Peter. And finally, maybe this could be a way to flesh out the Jameson and Spider-Man dynamic. Originally, this story starts with the death of Jonah's wife, and maybe they could adapt this in some way where it gives this MCU version of Jameson more depth. Because as much as I love J.K. Simmons, the more I think about it, the more I find myself not impressed with this iteration of the character so far. IDK, maybe his Raimi appearances just ruined any future versions of this character. I know I started off this list talking about the black suit Spidey and the birth of Venom, but another reason why I want to see that in the MCU is because of other stories it can lead to, mainly Maximum Carnage. That storyline is one of the best Carnage stories ever and shows just how much of an unstoppable force the Red Symbiote can be. But really, the reason that I want to see this specific story in the MCU is because of the Spider-Man and Venom team-up. These two make great enemies, and there's a huge portion of the audience that wants to see Tom Hardy's Venom fight Tom Holland's Spider-Man. But frankly, I would rather see them as a team. Watching Spider-Man and Venom team up is always great because it's sort of like teaming up with your ex. It's awkward for sure, and their team-ups are always filled with tension and unease. Plus, their methods are always different, with Venom not being afraid to use a little excess force from time to time. And Carnage is the perfect villain for both of them to face together. Look, I'm one of those people who really enjoyed Venom Let There Be Carnage because it was quick, breezy, and fun, but even I admit that their treatment of Carnage, who is an insanely powerful villain and a dangerous threat to the whole Marvel universe, was a little lackluster. Taking Carnage off the board in one movie seems like wasted potential. So is it too much to ask to have a Carnage in the MCU, then adapt Maximum Carnage, and eventually lead to an MCU Spidey and Venom team-up? I don't think that's an unreasonable request. The Last Remains storyline actually sounds very similar to a lot of what I've already mentioned, but there's a few things in it that make me want to see some sort of adaptation in the MCU. For one, the story revolves around a demon called Kindred who torments Peter. And just right away, I think the idea of this version of Spider-Man diving into more mystical stuff is pretty fascinating. Yes, we're entering a big street-level phase for the Webhead, but seeing him take on demons could be a fun new challenge for the Webhead. Like, he's already dealt with the multiverse before it became a big thing, so wouldn't it be funny to see the rest of the MCU dealing with the multiverse, and then Peter has already moved to the next thing and is fighting demons? Classic Peter Parker luck. But another thing of note is that the demon Kindred does resurrect Mysterio in this arc, which is something that I know fans would be happy to see again because Jake Gyllenhaal was a delight as Quentin Beck, and his relationship with Spider-Man should have lasted more than just one movie. So you'll notice that an overall theme for this list is taking Peter to a bit of a darker place in the next movie. And one of the best ways to do that is by adapting stuff like the death of Jean Dewolff. Look, we all know Peter loses a lot, and we're all familiar with Gwen Stacy and Uncle Ben, but another really traumatic loss for Peter was the murder of police captain Jean Dewolff. Dewolff was an ally for Spider-Man, and the two worked together quite a bit and built a level of trust. But then Dewolff was eliminated by a crazy serial killer known as Sin Eater. It took Peter to a really dark place as he tried to hunt down Sin Eater to get revenge. And here's where the story is interesting. This arc mainly featured Spider-Man teaming up with Daredevil, and Daredevil is the one who helps Peter not take Sin Eater's life when he has the chance. It's a great team-up arc that brings Peter to the darker underbelly of New York, and we get a team-up with a fantastic hero. It's still sort of unclear what the overall future plans for Daredevil are, but after No Way Home, I know I'm not the only one who wants to see Daredevil and Spidey go have a team-up movie, right? Speaking of team-ups, I wanted to end with one fun one. I've been focused on a lot of dark things on this list, but I guess I can't forget that Spider-Man doesn't need to be dark and grim to be compelling. He's your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man after all. So how about we adapt one of the many Spider-Man and Human Torch team-ups from the comics? The arc Spider-Man/Human Torch I'm With Stupid is a comical look at just how different these two heroes are. The relationship between Spider-Man and Human Torch is one of the most fascinating in the comics, and it would be great to introduce that rivalry into the MCU in some capacity, right? Especially with the MCU's Fantastic Four right around the corner. How about we also include the storyline where Peter Parker grows extra arms and has to learn to manage with that? It's not necessarily an important story for the character, but I think it would be funny to see Tom Holland freak out about that, don't you?